Yesterday, I posted my review of children's stories from old British and Irish legends. So now, with this book finished and reviewed, that now opens up a new space on my reading schedule. And I thought it was time to get back into the adult pool for a while. So, if you've been watching this channel, the last several books I've reviewed have all been children's books. Harriet the Spy, A Wrinkle in Time, and now children's stories from old British and Irish legends. And, well, I firmly maintain there's nothing wrong with reading children's books occasionally, or even a little bit more than occasionally. It's good to balance these things out, and so I've decided to come back to some adult books with Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. Now, this is probably a book which needs no introduction to a lot of you here on BookTube. I've seen this book being discussed on BookTube a lot. I myself have held this book up on camera once before. I'll link to that video down below. But I had checked this out of the library earlier this year, intending to read it for Tet holiday here in Vietnam, and then didn't get around to reading it at the time. But I've checked it out of the library again, and this time am actually going to read it. So this book has been on my reading list for forever. I think I first heard about it about 10 years ago. The book came out in 2009, according to Wikipedia, but I first heard about it 10 years ago when a coworker recommended it to me. He said he was reading a historical novel about Thomas Cromwell, and it was really, really good. And I thought, well, okay, but how interesting can Thomas Cromwell be? But he was saying it was a really good book. And since then, I've heard any number of people recommend this book very highly. Now, like I said, I suspect for most people on BookTube, this book doesn't need an introduction. But if there's one thing I've learned over the years or over my time on the internet, it's that you can never assume that everybody knows everything or that there's something that everybody knows. So I'll try and give this a brief background. Thomas Cromwell was an administrator for Henry VIII. Henry VIII, of course, is the English king who's famous for two reasons. One is for having six wives, several of whom he killed. I think it goes divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived for number six. So he had at least two of them beheaded, two of them divorced, one of them died of natural causes, and then the last one survived him. So a bit of a turbulent personality, but also famous for initiating the English Reformation, because famously the Pope would not grant him a divorce, so he founded the Church of England. Now he did that for somewhat selfish reasons. He wanted a divorce. But he was guided through that by genuine Protestant idealists or reformers who genuinely did want a Protestant Reformation in England. And one of his most able administrators in doing that was Thomas Cromwell. Now, at the time my coworker recommended this book to me and said it was about Thomas Cromwell, I had a rough idea of who Thomas Cromwell was. I first heard about him when listening to the BBC radio program This Sceptred Isle. Now, truth be told, I'm much more interested in Oliver Cromwell than Thomas Cromwell. They have same last name and I think are distantly related. Oliver Cromwell was the head of Britain's protectorate during England's brief experiment with republicanism and abolishing the monarch. And as a period of British history, I find endlessly fascinating, and I have talked about before on this channel. So I already knew who Oliver Cromwell was, and the BBC, The Sceptred Isle, went through. It was a radio show, so I listened to it like I do audiobooks. It was mostly on in the background. I had a British friend who gave me a copy of the whole show that he had gotten off some downloading website. Probably not legally, but anyways, I had a copy of the whole thing. Uh, it's a history of Britain. Was listening to it, and I listened to the parts on Henry VIII, but it didn't really stick with me. But it was later in the series they made a comparison. They said that what a certain king needed, I forget what his name is, was he said was another Cromwell, not an Oliver Cromwell, but a Thomas Cromwell, like an able administrator, a guy who can just kind of get things done, which was what which was what Thomas Cromwell was to King Henry VIII. So, like I usually do with audiobooks or radio shows or podcasts, this Sceptered Isle I listened to several times through. So that comparison stuck Thomas Cromwell in my mind, and then the next time I listened through to it, the next several times, I picked up on more of his story. I also did as an audiobook Monarchy by David Starkey, in which Thomas Cromwell. I'm gonna be mixing them up all through this video, aren't I? Thomas Cromwell also figured prominently during some of his sections on Henry VIII. And then I watched the TV show The Tudors. I think it was a Showtime TV show. I got the DVD box set when I was out in Cambodia. You can get DVDs cheap there. And I worked my way through the whole series of The Tudors, in which, of course, Thomas Cromwell was a prominent figure for a couple seasons until he wasn't. Spoiler alert, he eventually gets beheaded by Henry VIII when Henry VIII decides that Thomas Cromwell is no longer useful to him. Henry VIII was a volatile character. If you weren't useful to him, he would get very angry at you and you were liable to get beheaded. I thought during the sections that Thomas Cromwell was portrayed on the screen, he was interesting. I was largely sympathetic to him. I don't know if that's my Protestant bias. I grew up Protestant. I'm agnostic now, but I grew up Protestant. I think he was, if memory serves, and it was about 10 years ago that I worked my way through that TV show, The Tudors. He was portrayed as somebody who was a genuine Protestant, but also was somebody who was hungry for power and a little bit Machiavellian. And I think that's how he's commonly portrayed, as somebody who was hungry for access to power, like all these guys around Henry VIII war, all the guys who wanted access to the levers of government, but also I think did genuinely want a Protestant Reformation in England. He is commonly portrayed against Thomas More. So Thomas More, the author of Utopia, who was famously ordered beheaded by King Henry VIII, and who Cromwell had been an opponent of. So, for example, I believe in the famous movie A Man for All Seasons, Thomas Cromwell is portrayed as the villain there, and Thomas More is portrayed as the hero. So yeah, that's the background to who he is. Now, having said all that, let me admit the limits of my knowledge. I only know my history through the three things I mentioned: The Sceptered Isle, Monarchy by David Starkey, and the Tudors TV show. So that's the source of my knowledge, and that's also the limitations of my knowledge. Also, it's been about 10 or 12 years since I was listening or watching any of those. So it's a little bit faded in the memory now. I don't know if I got anything wrong just now in my brief historical recap. I'm sure I oversimplified stuff. Let me know in the comments. You can correct me if I'm in need of correction. So, point being, I guess I knew who Thomas Cromwell was, and I guess you could say I was kind of interested in him. I was a little bit surprised that everybody was loving this book so much because I didn't think Thomas Cromwell was that interesting. But yeah, it's been praised by many people. It's been praised a lot here on BookTube. Um, Steve Donahue has mentioned it frequently. I watch a lot of Steve Donahue's videos now. If you do watch Steve Donahue, you know it's impossible to find. If you're looking to cite one of his old videos, it's impossible to find it because he does like 5 videos a day. But in a couple of his videos, I think Steve Donahue. I hope I'm not gonna. I hope I'm not misrepresenting him here. I think Steve Donahue is of the opinion that Hilary Mantel, in writing this book, is being deliberately subversive to the historical record. So, Steve Donahue thinks that in the historical record, Thomas Cromwell was a Machiavellian thug, and that Hilary Mantel knows that. But Hilary Mantel is doing a little bit of experiment in framing history, where she takes the historical record and writes a historical novel which does not contradict any of the facts in any ways, but just tries to create a framing in which Thomas Cromwell is all of a sudden not this Machiavellian thug on a power trip, but this social justice warrior. And I think Steve Donahue compares it to the historical novel about Mussolini, M, which I also have not read, but apparently is something that is doing a similar thing with its subversive framing. I guess that's the gimmick of this book is taking somebody who is not a likable person based on the historical record and making him really likable and sympathetic. Just I mean, based on just this, what I've read, it doesn't sound like Hilary Mantel is trying to be subversive. It sounds like, I don't know, the framing I get from the publisher's introduction is that this is who she believes Cromwell really is. But how much can you trust those things, huh? This is part of a trilogy, and part of the reason I've delayed reading this, one of the many reasons, is I'm the type of person who would want to do the whole trilogy or not do it at all. Have all 3 books ready and just read them all as one series. And when you live out in Asia, I live in Vietnam, so, sometimes finding books can be an issue. I mean, there are always books, but finding specific books can be an issue. I'm kicking myself a little bit because there have been opportunities in the past where I had the opportunity to buy the whole trilogy and didn't do it at the time. And now I don't see it in the books. I haven't seen these books in the bookstores here in Vietnam recently. I got this book out of my school library. You can see it's a library book. But they only have this book. They don't have the whole trilogy in my library. Now, it's possible I might be able to special order it from bookstores. I was checking this online earlier and possibly. But if I can't track this down here in Vietnam, then I've decided that I'm just going to read the first book and then see where it goes from there. Now that I've reached middle age, I'm trying to be less, what's the word I want to use? Anal retentive about my reading. Was that the best word to use? Before I always used to try and wait until I was able to track down the whole set before I would read anything. But now, as time is rapidly getting away from me, and I've facing the fact that my life is half over, the new motto is just read what you can when you get a hold of it. And also, I'm trying to reread more, partly, well, for a number of reasons, partly the influence of BookTube. So where the rereading comes in is if I read a book in a series. If I can't find the rest of the series, then I just let it go. And then if at some point in the future I happen to get my hands on the whole set, then I can always just reread this book as an introduction into it. Sorry, not as an introduction into it. I can reread this book as a way to get back into it before continuing with the series. Sometimes I just lose track of what I want to say, which maybe is a good indication that it's time to just finish this video. So yeah, this is the next reading project. I have already this afternoon gotten 13 pages into it, and I'm happy to report that I do find it quite readable, and I find the prose to be well done. I was a little bit worried. Sometimes books that everybody praises, I end up not liking. I'm thinking of examples of this would be Beloved by Toni Morrison, or the Alexander the Great trilogy by Mary Renault. Both of those books, everybody talked about how wonderful the prose was and the style, and I just found them to be, it wasn't for me. They were too poetic and not easy to read. But this book, based on the first 13 pages, looks like it's going to be good going, easy going. There have been some mixed reports on this book. Some booktubers have reported struggling with it. I don't want to mention anybody by name in case I'm misremembering it, although I'm thinking of a couple of you in mind. Although that I think that may have been more with keeping the historical names straight rather than the prose style. And like I mentioned, I've got at least somewhat of a background in knowing who these people are, and maybe I'll be referring to these family trees frequently. I saw somebody, another coworker, reading it about half a year ago, and I asked him about it. I said I heard some people say that book's a little bit difficult. And he says, no. He said it's so smooth and easy to read. It's like butter. That's what he said. But butter was the metaphor he used. So and so far, I think I'm leaning towards that opinion, just in the first 13 pages here. So anyways, this is the new book on my reading rotation now, and I will report back on how this is coming in the weekly reading vlogs. And then once I finish this up, I'll give it a review.